So let's just go ahead and we're going to start this thing off talking about what is a wet, dry, wet rig actually. So the thing that I've seen most commonly described on YouTube and a lot and people who actually send us emails asking us about various ways to run things, they'll describe a scenario that kind of looks like this. So you have a guitar going in, you'll have some sort of overdrive, fuzzes, dry related stuff that looks like this, and then it'll go into some sort of splitter, hopefully that's isolated. And one side of that splitter will go to what they're calling the dry amp, and then the other side will go to what they call the wet amp. However, the wet amp really isn't wet because the overdrive and fuzz still go to that amp. So it's kind of more like, I consider this to be a split stereo system, where you have one side that's getting the mono feed with gain pedals, and then the stereo side is only getting I guess it's really not even a stereo. It's really just a dual mono split system that has partial pedals going to one amp and partial pedals, and all the pedals going to the other amp. So in other words, all the pedals are going to the wet amp and only some pedals are going to the dry amp. This is not wet dry. And I'm not really sure how it got that moniker, or whether it was just like a cool way to reappropriate the name and make it new, but that's not what it is at all. And really the thing to understand about wet, dry, wet really it arcs back to like early rack days with MIDI programmable stuff, and even predating some of the MIDI stuff when rack stuff was starting to be integrated into like studio racks. So I should say the studio racks like an engineer would use, or a studio rack that was in like a in a recording studio, and guitar players would want to start to incorporate some of those things that would be used in the studio into their actual guitar systems that they would travel with or that they would go to sessions with. And so what you ended up seeing was stuff like, Eventide H3000s that weren't particularly voiced or designed for the guitar in particular. You would have those being adapted to work in a guitar context, and these were really 100% wet effects. So you would find these, for a mixing bus, and these would have terminal strips and things like that in the back. They weren't even thought to be part of this whole equation. But when guitar players wanted to use them, what they would end up doing is they would have these 100% wet devices. A lot of them were mono in and stereo out, and so you would run these basically in a parallel mixer of some kind between the preamp and the power amp. And then you would run these 100% wet, and then you would have this mixer that you were able to blend stuff in. In the old days, they used to use a lot of these Rain rack mixers. There were like maybe 6 channels, but then guys like Robert Bradshaw kind of simplified that and maybe had multiple different mixes that could occur, but there would just be some volume controls on the outside. So really, it's like here's an easier way, I think, to understand what wet, dry, wet means. So here's the original diagram. This is what most people these days are referring to as wet, dry, wet. And then I want you to see how this changes when we actually go to what is actual wet, dry, wet. So in this scenario, you can see, I'm going to get rid of the Rig Doctor Live thing here just so you can see this a little bit better. So you can see here that the guitar comes in, it goes to the dry effects, right? The stuff that's not doing any sort of modulation or pitch shifting or delaying or reverb. That's going into one amp. And then you're taking a line out of that amp. Now, not everybody has a line out, but you could use things like this if you don't have a line out, the Sir line out box. And there's a couple of other companies that make line out boxes. So if you didn't have an effects loop where you could use the send, which is the same as a line out, you could use a line out box through an amp that doesn't have that. And then you would go out of that line out from the dry amp into a parallel mixer. Parallel mixer would then get your wet effects. So you'd have modulation, let's say in mix 1, delay in mix 2, reverb in mix 3. Now there's different ways that you can do this, but this is the most typical way, where they'd just go into a parallel mixer and they would be mixed 100% wet. And then that parallel mixer would go into a power amp. So they wouldn't actually even need to necessarily go into an amp input, and that's why I put an X over the input. because you're not getting the preamp at all of that second amp. That wet amp is just going into the power amp section. So if it had an effects loop, you'd go into the power amp return, or which is the same as the power amp input. You'd be going into the power amp input basically on this, or the return of an effects loop, or you'd go into an actual physical power amp that would then feed monitors, speaker cabinets, which you would then have as your wet cabinet. In this scenario, there is no dry at all, no distortion whatsoever that is coming out of the wet amp. As long as those pedals are either kill dry or 100% wet, which is how they have to be set, and not all pedals can do that, so you have to have certain types of pedals that can work like that, those are going to be 100% wet, and you're only going to get wet signal coming out of that amp. So you're going to have one amp that's going to get totally dry. There is no dry that's going on to the wet amp in the way that the first diagram showed. So this is the way that some other people are talking about wet, dry, wet. You can see in this scenario that that wet amp gets everything, gets every pedal in there. So really this is more like a dry, wet, dry, but it's a splitting system. It's not using it in texturally, sonically, and I'll show some examples of this because I'm going to be shooting some more video of this new rig that I'm doing. You'll actually get to hear how dimensionally it is much different, and I'll run it both ways so you can hear kind of the way that people are calling wet dry now and what's actually the proper way to do a wet dry or a wet dry wet. And really only the difference between wet dry and wet dry wet is you'd be using stereo effects to get the wet dry wet. So you'd be using stereo effects in this mixer example that I showed you. In this parallel mixer, you'd be using stereo effects in there, and then you would be going out of the parallel mixer with two different outputs, one that would feed one like the left wet cabinet and the other that would feed the right wet cabinet. Again, they'd be going into a power amp of some kind, and before they would be feeding those cabinets. But this is the way that you would be doing it. Now, one person was saying that there would be dry in all cabs. Well, you'd have the option to run dry in all those cabs, but a lot of those rack effects didn't have the ability to do dry. Now, some of the parallel mixers would have a dry through that you could activate, but typically when guys would be doing the wet, dry, wet, they would be running them 100% wet because they wouldn't want any of the distortion side of the dry mix to be coming through the wet cabinets, so that they could really get those really accurate and really pristine kind of ping-ponging. It also is a good effect to use in the studio because you would always have a dry reference and you wouldn't necessarily have to use the wet mix at all if this engineer decided, you know what, I'm going to just reamp this thing later. I don't like the texture that was added to this particular mix. They could just take away whatever those mics were picking up in the wet cabinets and then just reamp the dry, or do some sort of processing in post. And this was a lot more useful in particular before Pro Tools existed, because in Pro Tools you can easily do a lot of these treatments in post, especially in terms of using delays and reverbs, where back then they couldn't just as easily have done those things. They could obviously have the ability to be able to reamp stuff, but it wasn't as easy or as simple to do as it is now.